Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. In our history of revolutionary ideas, we have reached the 17th century, and the next two episodes are about two English revolutions of the 17th century. The first, which usually gets called the Civil War, the second, which sometimes gets called the Glorious Revolution. Today it's the Civil War, and I'm talking to the historian of England and Ireland and Scotland, Clare Jackson, about whether that war was also really a revolution. What was the thinking behind it, and what were the new kinds of thinking that came out of it? Claire, we probably should start just with the basic questions of what we call this period, because there are lots of different names, and it slightly depends on when you date it as well. So we're talking about the middle of the 17th century. There is something called the War of the Three Kingdoms, which I think conventionally is said to run from 1639 to 53. And that overlaps with the event that we're going to be talking about, which is usually called the English Civil War. But even then, sometimes people say there were two civil wars or three civil wars. But the conventional dating of that one is 1642 to 49. And then at various points, then and since, people have called this the English Revolution. We're going to talk about another revolution in the next episode. And the English Revolution, again, depends when you date it. So if you're talking about a revolution as a sort of big turning of the wheel, 1642 to 1660, Parliament rises up against the king, but 18 years later, the king's son comes back. Or maybe on other accounts, there is something at the heart of this event, which is the revolutionary moment, maybe late 1640s, early 1650s. So there's a whole host of ways we could try and characterize what it is we're talking about before we get onto the question of the revolution. Which one are you happiest with?
I certainly think we could probably spend the entire episode just talking about nomenclature. I think it's important to emphasize that the English Revolution, which is what we're talking about today in terms of the mid-17th century, wouldn't have been called by that name really until the 20th century. I mean, the first person to call the period that we're talking about, the 1640s and 50s, the English Revolution, was perhaps tellingly a French historian, Guizot, in his history of the revolution in England that was published first in the 1820s. And he was looking for something that looked to him like the French Revolution. But in the Anglophone world, there's a really wonderful moment in 1938 where the doyen of history, Trevelyan, Regius Professor in Cambridge, publishes a book called The English Revolution in 1938. And he is talking entirely about 1688, the Glorious Revolution. He says it's a shame it wasn't called the Sensible Revolution. And this so infuriates a young Christopher Hill, who is about to be commissioned as an infantry officer in the war, that he publishes another very slim book called The English Revolution in 1940. And for Hill, the English Revolution must be the mid-1640s and 1650s. And in a way, just in that very short moment between 1938 and 1940, you get that real division of interest between what should be called the English Revolution. But calling this period a revolution was a minority taste. One of the first extensive histories of it was produced by one of the protagonists, Edward Hyde, Earl of Clarendon, his history of the Great Rebellion that's posthumously published in the early 18th century. And for him, this is a rebellion. It's not a revolution. And I think probably we can have lots of discussions about nomenclature. As you said, we can also talk about chronology, but probably we also need to think that there's two things going on here. As you said, there's an ideological revolution, but there's also a very brutal civil war.
The War of the Three Kingdoms, the one that potentially overlaps the three kingdoms being England, Scotland, and Ireland. 1639, when that gets going, and that gets going in Scotland. We did a previous episode on Calvin with Alec Ryrie, and he talked about Scotland in the second half of the 16th century as a quintessentially revolutionary nation. Does some of that carry through in the sense that when we think about this as a revolutionary event, is some of the impetus for it actually coming from Scotland and not from England? Some of the origin of the revolutionary impulse at this period?
Well, certainly that was one of the reactions to the idea that this is an English revolution, that it doesn't make sense to look at this in purely English terms. I talked about Christopher Hill's insistence that this was an English revolution that was so sort of climacteric in terms of the national imagination. And for him, and also for a later historian, the 1970s, Lawrence Stone, it was very odd that we don't treat the English Revolution with the same kind of veneration, or it doesn't occupy such a big part of our national consciousness as, say, the French Revolution or the American Revolution. And we can talk about their sort of interpretations later. But they were still looking very much at an English Revolution. They were interested in it as being a very long term response to changes in land structure and sort of really looking at things through a Marxist viewpoint. That triggered a very large backlash among a generation of historians in the 1980s and 1990s, later given the sort of shorthand revisionists. And one of the most productive areas of revisionist analysis was to say, we can't look at England in isolation. Charles I, king at the time, was not just king of England, as you say, he was also king of Scotland and Ireland. And if one's looking at chains of causation, it is true that the Scots were the first to take up arms against Charles I in 1637, 1638. There was also a rebellion in Ireland in 1641. And finally, the English take up arms in 1642. They're almost reluctant revolutionaries in that sense. So where does the revolutionary impulse come from? Well, one of the interesting things of the wars of the three kingdoms is that there are common threads from one kingdom to another, but there are also clearly specific circumstances in each. The one common thread is Charles I. He is monarch of all three kingdoms. But the multiple monarchy that he rules over and that his father James VI and first had ruled over is unusual in that it's very confessionally mixed. That in England you have a fairly young Protestant church that had been created as a sort of an active state under Henry VIII. To its critics, it looks but halfly reformed. It still has features that look like the old Catholic religion, sort of bishops. In Scotland, you have a very different Protestant church that had been forged through a grassroots rebellion in the face of a Catholic monarch, Mary Queen of Scots, much more keen on Presbyterian models and equality. And in Ireland, you have a majority Catholic population and a very minority established church. And in each of those three kingdoms, there's a substantial minority that look to the other kingdom for inspiration. So when Charles, perhaps unadvisedly, creates in his own mind a vision of the national church in each of the kingdoms that is at one end of this Protestant spectrum, that is much more ceremonialist and much more interested in the beauty of holiness, and tries to impose that on the Scottish church, it leads to rebellion. A sort of grassroots rebellion starts in a church and then spreads into a formation of a covenanting movement in which the Scots bond together to sign what is later known as the National Covenant, defending their right to preserve, as they see it, the true religion, while also proclaiming their loyalty to Charles I. What's never very clear in that covenant is what happens if those two things come into conflict with one another. But that then is met not with compromise or a willingness to listen to those grievances by Charles I, but he sees it as a direct assault on his authority. His response, his default response is to sort of think about mobilization and suppressing this revolt. He even thinks about raising Catholic troops in Ireland. And to the Scots, given that they are registering their protest about what they regard as an unacceptable religious change, the idea that their king might use Catholic troops is terrifying. They mobilize, and that leads to a series of military engagements known as the Bishops' Wars between the English and the Scots.
By the time we reach 1642, and this war in Scotland has then helped to trigger armed conflict between Parliament in England and the king, as seen from a wider European perspective, this is the era of religious wars across the continent. This is the era of dynastic war. This is an incredibly unstable, turbulent period in European history. Seen from the Netherlands, there's been a revolt going on there for generations. This is a violent, unstable period. Does what happens in England in 1642, coming out of this earlier conflict a few years earlier in Scotland, look like a radical or dramatic departure? Or does it seem to most people to sort of fold into an age of religious and dynastic war? This is the kind of thing that is happening. Is something distinct or special happening as seen from the outside? Or should we, from a European perspective in 1642 anyway, assume this is part of the spirit of the age?
That might be later how it's seen. I mean, one can look across Europe in the 1640s, as one royalist later put it, the world is off its hinges. There are certainly revolts going off everywhere in the 1640s. But I absolutely don't think that's how it would have been seen in England. Historiographically, one of the reactions against this idea that there is some kind of inevitable revolution that takes place is this emphasis on contingency and precarity, that the English in some ways could be seen as reluctant revolutionaries, that people take up arms almost as a last resort. The Scottish revolt, how that plays in directly to the English outbreak of hostilities is that it forces Charles I to call Parliament in England. Charles had bad relations with Parliament in the late 1620s and had pretty much decided to go for personal rule. So there was no English Parliament called between 1629 and 1640. Now, ironically, the 1630s look, compared to Europe, like halcyon days. England is not being laid waste as most of continental Europe is in the 30 Years' War. Rather, England is peaceful. This is allowing prosperity, unrevolutionary England. But once Charles gets himself into his hostilities with the Scots prevail militarily. They occupy the north of England. They're in Newcastle. He agrees a subsidy of £850 a day, which is a huge amount of money. He doesn't have that money. He has to call Parliament. But that gives his English critics a platform on which to level all of their grievances against him and to basically withhold funds until some of their grievances are met. That doesn't happen. And eventually, after a very prominent trial and execution of his main chief minister, Thomas Wentworth, Earl of Strafford, and then an Irish rebellion that needs suppressing, then eventually England itself dissolves into civil war, but not until the end of 1642. And even among some of the main protagonists, Bulstrode Whitlock is a very prominent lawyer and MP, and he talks about almost sort of sleepwalking into civil war. And he sort of says it's strange to see how we've insensibly slid into this beginning of a civil war. And a lot of key players look at the massive influence of the press, which is a new factor. If one's looking for sort of new factors, maybe during the 1630s, there would be about 450 publications a year. In the chaos of the early 1640s, that figure becomes more like 4,000 pamphlets coming off the press, each upping the ante, lots and lots of different sort of voices and different agendas. And as Whitlock says, from paper combats, declarations, remonstrances, protestations, votes, messages, answers, replies, somehow we're now talking about how we are going to raise an army. So I don't think one should underestimate that new element of the press also being an outlet.
And yet in that, certainly to start with, I'm assuming the assumption was this conflict, if it was going to end well for the parliamentary side, would end with the king being brought to heel, essentially, that the king's power, which had become excessive, would be curtailed. There would be a new arrangement in which the king would remain king, king of England and Scotland and Ireland as well, but his kingship would be more limited. Is it possible to identify a point as the conflict unfolded at which that seemed to these reluctant revolutionaries to become untenable, that we move from a war to discipline the king to a war which may well, and at a certain point will, mean the removal of the king?
If so, very, very late in that process. There are two wars. I mean, there is what we now would call, obviously contemporaries wouldn't, but we would call the First Civil War. And that ends pretty decisively in a parliamentarian victory. Huge set piece encounters, the Battle of Marston Moor in 1644, Battle of Naseby in 1645. And one of the key military factors had been an alliance between Parliament and the Scottish Covenanters. And the Scots had trusted, if you like, their English allies, that any settlement would result in a Presbyterian church. And the English parliamentarians had realised the huge strategic advantage of having the Scots on board. So Charles is comprehensively defeated in that First Civil War. But it's interesting, I mean, even as late as September 1645, after Naseby, you hear the parliamentarian general, Sir Thomas Fairfax, telling Charles's German nephew, Prince Rupert, that the crown of England is and will be where it ought to be. We're fighting to keep it there. So you're right that on both sides, the idea was always to have the crown where it had been, but to ensure that, as they would see it, Charles was ruling lawfully, that Parliament was being summoned.
But if this was going to be some kind of Presbyterian settlement, did they really believe that this king would be able to stomach it? Wasn't that early on a sign that this might not work out that way?
Charles is not prepared to stomach most things. I mean, Charles doesn't think that his subjects should be fighting against him in the first place. He doesn't think they've got the right to negotiate with him. And later, he certainly doesn't think they've got the right to put him on trial. The problem is what to do after the First Civil War. There's also a new model army that has been created as well. The first time that there's a professional army that isn't locally related to its area, that can move anywhere. And that army also has a very keen sense of its own honour and its professionalism. So you begin to get divisions between parliamentarians, of whom the majority favour some kind of Presbyterian settlement, hopefully with Charles, and the army, who feel that they're not being radical enough and that some vindication needs to be made of the lives that have been lost. And Charles is, throughout all this, an incredibly slippery person with whom to negotiate. Although he's in army custody, he escapes and goes to the Isle of Wight and then forms a new alliance with the Scots. And the Scots have become very disillusioned with the way in which English parliamentarianism is fracturing. It's no longer just a sort of support for Presbyterianism. The New Model Army is much more radical in its decentralized sense of Congregationalist religion. And also, Charles by then seems a completely unworthy and unreliable negotiator. That results in a much more brutal Second Civil War. By then, Cromwell is the military mastermind. And by then, within the army at any rate, there is a real frustration over the idea of a negotiated settlement. It's the army that, in a declaration in 1647, says, "We weren't a mercenary army," and by 1648 is beginning to identify Charles as being the capital grand author of our troubles, the person on whom fault for the civil wars must be laid and who also has blood on his hands. But the only way the army can push forward their agenda is by effectively a coup. So in late 1648, frustration with Parliament continuing to try and negotiate with Charles. So there's an event known as Pride's Purge, in which the army basically surrounds Parliament, prevents any MPs that they don't regard as being sufficiently radical from taking their seats, and you end up with a rump, sort of around 200 MPs. And they're the ones who push forward a much more radical solution to put Charles on trial.
As we move to the more radical solution, it is also a move from a sense that the problem here is the person of the king, Charles himself. And there might be a wish that there were a different king. And in English history, there have been many moments where the thought is the problem is the king, let's replace this king with another king. To something which is more like what we would now call republicanism, an idea that the problem is kingship itself, and that what is needed is a new set of ideas, or to draw on an old set of ideas but give them a new form, in which England will become a land without a monarch and will be ruled in some other form. Is the decisive moment in that story the act of putting him on trial? Because I think I'm right in saying that for contemporaries, this was the shocking event, seen both inside and outside England. Not kings get killed, kings get bumped off, kings get replaced, but to put a king on trial as though he were just another citizen and to execute him. Is that the real radicalism of this story laid bare when that event gets underway?
Certainly among contemporaries, and we can talk about foreign reaction. I mean, that is the bit that is seen as horrific, if anything.
Is there a parallel for it?
Well, interestingly, among the French, they are shocked by the sort of temerity of the English Parliament deciding to put its Scots-born king. One shouldn't forget that, Charles is Scots-born, and the Scots are outraged. And that is one big difference in outlook. The Scots, although they are very, very frustrated with Charles I, they never lose that sense of allegiance to the Stuart monarchy. But the French look at this and say, this is monstrous, this is execrable. But the English have form on this. They are aware that only 2 generations earlier, the English had put Charles's grandmother, Mary Queen of Scots, on trial. She had been a former queen consort in France. At least then the English had had the decency to put a queen on trial for treason behind closed doors and execute her privately. I mean, what they find, utterly vulgar and utterly unacceptable is the idea that Charles is put to death in 1649 by the common executioner, by the common hangman. So that is certainly very, very shocking in all of this.
The trial of Mary Queen of Scots, the trial and execution, as you say, she was tried as a queen. It was understood it had to be a special event, and some of the agonies that Elizabeth suffered in deciding to put her to death was the knowledge that the death of a queen, certainly authorized by a queen, was an extremely perilous event, but that she would be treated as a queen. It wasn't, in a sense, an attack on the idea of monarchy, but this unequivocally was. This was going to have to be a republic. There was, in a way, no going back. at least in the short term, from this act. This was now republicanism, wasn't it? By the time we get to the trial of Charles.
It's also a very clear crystallization of the king's two bodies. I mean, that's a much older idea, that you could have an office that itself was well constructed, that had all sorts of powers, but that might be filled by a fallible individual. And in this case, the fallible individual is Charles I. So, I mean, Charles himself utterly denies that this is even possible. How on earth can he be guilty of treason against himself? Treason on the statute books is an act against the monarch, and this attempt by the English Parliament to redefine it as a sort of treason acting against the body politic is to Charles nonsensical, and also nonsensical to quite a lot of people. I mean, the Rump Parliament has to work exceedingly hard to find a justice who is going to preside over this trial on the grounds that this is supposed to be the monarch dispensing justice. Does that necessarily lead to republicanism? Well, the interesting thing about the immediate post-regicide period is, yes, you have actions taken by the Rump Parliament to abolish the monarchy, to abolish the House of Lords. But in terms of its public statements, they're not immediate. I think it takes 2 months before the act confirming that England is now a Commonwealth and a free state is issued. They are more descriptors of what has happened than great Republican salvos.
And that gets to the question of whether this is a revolution of ideas or a more recognizable set of contingent political events. It is also true that in this period, the Second Civil War and its aftermath, there is greater radicalism in the realm of ideas. So this is the age of the levelers. Many people will be familiar. This is one of the legacies of the English Civil War period. The idea that 1648, 1649, there emerged a new kind of radical thinking about the possibilities of the world that would come next after this war was over. And it included not just familiar Republican ideas, but a new kind of demand for representation of, by no means everybody, but of ordinary English male subjects. It included the demands for a more responsive politics. In some forms, the most radical form, maybe the Diggers, a new kind of millenarian, egalitarian politics. Are these things connected and running together, or should we still see them as separate? You've got the high politics of the trial and then the post hoc justifications and a kind of stumbling into a republic. And you've got bubbling up underneath, most of it coming from the army, almost none of it coming from parliament, from common soldiers, and then eventually to be put down by army discipline. You've got a new radicalism. How should we see the relationship between these two? And I know the historiography turns in part on this, but some people wanting to make that connection. How do you see it?
I think each generation sort of fights the civil wars in terms of what they've been interested in. And certainly the levelers became of massive interest in the 20th century. People became fascinated by this, especially also with the discovery of new sources. So things like the Putney debates between more radical elements within the army and the army grandees in 1647. They weren't known about until the records of it were discovered in the late 19th century. So there is always a sort of interest in particular aspects of it. Are they related? Clearly, they're all products of the same events. But I think what you also begin to get is a distrust of all forms of established authority. So the Quakers are a sect that emerge in this period of the English Revolution, distrusting all forms of intermediary between an individual and God. Leveller is a term of abuse for most people. I mean, the diggers eventually say they are the true levelers, and the only way you can be a leveller is by digging up the earth and creating a communitarian stronghold in Surrey. I think the levelers are a fascinating attempt to commit to paper certain visions of an alternative future. There's probably been much more of a disproportionate interest in franchise, how much of this is a sort of precursor for universal suffrage. Actually, they are interested in all sorts of aspects of social reform. Things like the legal system should be rendered into English. You should be able to be understood. If you're being put on trial for something, you should be able to understand what it is. People shouldn't be imprisoned for debt. So I think it's partly the collapse of pre-publication censorship, so anything can now be printed by anyone. It's clearly a phenomenally exciting and terrifying time to be alive. And perhaps rather than measuring, as you say, sort of failure of the leveller moment or whatever, they certainly open up a whole spectrum of ideas that don't go away.
One of the challenges for making sense of that period, as you said earlier, is that the radical high politics is driven by the army. And these are debates within the army. These are much more debates within the army than they are within parliament. The longer history wants to fold this into the history of what is going to become what we call a parliamentary democracy. And so people look for these early roots of some of the ideas that later get called democratic. But one of the challenges to that idea is that this is effectively a coup. And what is driving it is an institution, the new model army, which is not itself parliamentary. It is an armed force fighting brutal conflict. And in the end, it is governed by its generals. So the English Revolution also has to be understood as a coup. And that is sort of intellectually challenging if you want to tell that story of this is the origin of what's going to become a reimagined version of how the British state operates.
We also shouldn't lose sight of the fact that also it is that army that at the end decides to invite Charles II back in the Restoration. And I mean, that must have seemed in many ways the least likely outcome, that the same army that put Charles I on trial and executed him is the same army 11 years later that essentially invite Charles II back in the Restoration. And I think, again, even the language we use, we tend to think of the 1649-1660 period as often given the shorthand, the interregnum. But that in itself implies some form of anomaly, some form of oddity between regnal eras. And it is also, however, unfortunately for this story, also a period in which the whole idea is to turn the clock right back to 1641. So to restore the monarchy and almost to imagine away the 1650s and to insist that Charles II had been king ever since the moment of his father's execution.
Did the fact of the king's execution pose a real challenge for those people who had seen this conflict in backward looking terms as the restoration of traditional English liberty? So Magna Carta played a big role in these propaganda wars. The idea that this king, Charles I, had breached long standing understanding of the relationship between the monarch and the people of England that went back to Magna Carta or maybe even before Magna Carta. But once the king has been killed and this is a republic, Magna Carta is a document that presupposes the existence of a monarchy. It's not a republican document in any sense. Does it become harder to portray this event as a restoration of traditional liberties once the king has been executed?
Yes, it does. I think it's important to emphasize Magna Carta only begins to assume its totemic significance in the 17th century. I mean, it is Sir Edward Coke, as part of the opposition against Charles I earlier, and his father James, that vests in this much earlier document this iconic status as a sort of shibboleth of English liberties. What you have after the king dies is a sort of almost bewildering series of different types of constitutional experiment. It's important perhaps to divide the period into the post-regicide sort of 1649, 1653. That is when England looks more like a pure republic. It is a commonwealth, a free state, but it is still essentially run by the rump parliament. That is disappointing for those who think this is going to be a sort of energetic, reforming agenda. Part of the problem actually is that immediately the English Republic faces challenges to its own security by those who refuse to accept its legitimacy. It is again the army that then is sent to wage a war of conquest in Ireland that is incredibly brutal and has long lasting legacies there, as well as in Scotland, because immediately on Charles I's execution, the Scots crown him sort of in absentia and later in person King of Scotland, England, Ireland, and still kind of euphemistically France. So there is always a sort of inbuilt challenge through the Stuarts to the security of the Republic. Eventually, that first rump parliament is dissolved in 1653, and the second period of the 1650s, sort of 1653 to 8, the period of the Protectorate, begins to look more like a monarchy in all but name, is how it's often been described. Oliver Cromwell is made Lord Protector, and there are provisions for Parliament, and that is deeply disillusioning for those who felt that this was the moment to create a more pure, exclusively Republican model. I mean, again, offering caveats, but it's perhaps important to say that republicanism to a lot of people at the time didn't necessarily mean only king without a head. I mean, it meant an emphasis on the res publica and the best way in which that commonwealth might be governed. The majority of people would probably, and this is true of the 1640s, have felt that England was still some kind of mixed government, that there was always be a role for a monarch or a monarch-like figure to rule in conjunction with Parliament, the Lord spiritual and temporal. And then the sort of supreme irony of this period becomes you have a Lord Protector, Cromwell. There are various iterations of the Protectorate, but in 1657, the House of Commons offer him the crown. And this is a moment of deep introspection for Cromwell, but eventually he turns it down and says, I cannot take on something that God has already, that Providence has rejected. But the court culture that emerges from the Protectorate looks quasi-monarchical, the trappings of power that Cromwell portrays.
In that period, 1649 to 53, when, as you say, this looks more like a conventional republic. What are the models? So, what are the models as seen from England? Are they thinking of this in Roman or Neo Roman terms? Are they thinking of this in Renaissance Italian terms, the Italian city state models? Are they looking to the Dutch, to the Netherlands? And likewise, as seen from the outside, when people looked at England, they've executed the king. This is a shocking thing. They've treated the king as a common criminal. So they've clearly gone mad. At the same time, they're doing something which is not completely unfamiliar. They're trying to govern in this way, in this republican way. Was it seen as a distinctive English version of republicanism, or could it be folded into a wider European story? This is England now trying to be a republic of a kind that we at least recognize. They haven't constitutionally gone mad.
Well, given that the majority of European states at this stage remain monarchies, to many people they have gone mad. I mean, Philip II doesn't like hearing that people like Admiral Robert Blake are standing in the town square in Cadiz in 1651 saying that, England is going to give you the example by which all kingdoms will annihilate tyranny and become republics. I mean, there is a real fear about the infectious export of republicanism. In terms of the debates within England, yes, the 1650s is an incredibly fertile period for discussions about republics old and new. It's just that not many of them translate directly into the levers of power. There's always a fear that if really free elections are held, actually it might return a royalist majority. But this is still a very much a minority taste. As I say, the Republic is also somewhat concerned with its own security, suppressing royalist revolts in royalist uprisings, both at home in Scotland and in Ireland. So I think still the primary response of continental powers is alarm, but it is surprising how a de facto pragmatic response becomes the norm. The Spanish are the first to recognize the English Republic, and the English Republic itself is fairly skilled in keeping the trappings of legitimate power. So the sort of ambassadorial receptions look not so different from how they would have been under a monarchy. I mean, this isn't a republic that's very keen to reinvent itself stylistically or culturally as being very different. Cromwell sort of moves into the royal palaces. He signs himself Oliver P, and the statuary and the portraiture all looks, and that is not accidental. That is giving a degree of familiarity to both the domestic audience as well as foreigners. Cromwell himself is someone who once in the late 1640s said, he wasn't wedded and glued to forms of government. These were dross and dung in comparison of Christ. And that is very true. And that might not be the best person to be obsessed about constitutional niceties.
I was going to say, because one of the leading propagandists of the new regime was Milton, the poet. He was also a propagandist. And he made a concerted effort to delegitimize the idea of monarchy by essentially saying it's idolatrous, it's sacrilege, the idea of setting up this man as a kind of God on earth. We have a king, we have a ruler, God, Christ, and anything beneath that has to assume a republican form. If this is going to be a godly republic, we have got to completely reject the idea of kingship. Did Cromwell think like that too? So as you described in 1657, him having to weigh the question of whether or not to take on the crown, Cromwell was unquestionably a man of deep religious faith. Did he also think that at least possibly the age of kings was past, that in this new godly republic, there would have to be, even if he wasn't interested in constitutional niceties, there would have to be a new understanding of the relationship between power on earth and higher power?
Absolutely. But Cromwell is also an operator. I mean, he also has the business of government to be sort of getting on with. Talking about Milton's response, I mean, again, one of the biggest challenges to the Republic is a very skillful royalist counter-response. I mean, Charles I is almost never as popular as his moment on the scaffold, in which he warns those who can hear him over all the noise that if you submit to this kind of might is right, this is deeply worrying for the future. Icon Basilici, a sort of publication of apparently his imprisoned meditations and prayers, is a huge bestseller. And Milton finds himself obliged to counter that image of Charles as some martyred saint. The frontispiece of Icon Basilica shows Charles I kneeling like Christ with a crown of thorns. So, to the vast majority of interested, engaged onlookers, killing the Lord's anointed is still deeply traumatic. As you say, Milton tries to come back with iconoclastes to show one needs a much more clear preservative against idolatry. But the pure types of republicanism don't make themselves felt in the settlements. I mean, there are various iterations. Cromwell becomes very frustrated with the rump parliament, as it essentially is in 1653. They try a nominated assembly of individuals chosen for their godliness. That lasts 6 months. They try a form of military government. England is divided into 11 military districts in the mid 1650s, run by major generals. That is very expensive. All of these are, none of them are outright failures, but none of them are outright successes either. And I think for any revolutionary regime, there's a sort of kinetic energy that you feel you have to keep momentum going. You don't have the luxury that Charles I had of 11 years of personal rule in which sort of everyone unquestioningly accepts your authority. Actually, one of the big foreign policy successes is itself very revolutionary. Cromwell authorizes the Western design. It wasn't the original intent is to seize Hispaniola, but Jamaica is seized from the Spanish in 1655. And that is the first time that an English piece of land has been taken from a sitting colonial power. So, there are so many different fronts on which the Republic has to maintain legitimacy and success that I think one shouldn't lose sight of that.
And for us, with hindsight, this is a familiar revolutionary story. It wasn't, I think, then, recognizing the challenge of what is effectively a coup that is then dressed up as some kind of people's revolt, which is going to create a new kind of people's government. But before you can do that, you've got to secure the new regime. And it's very hard to secure the new regime while allowing the people their head. I mean, we are much more familiar with that story than I think they would have been. Is it also true that the revolutionary impulse here, I said at the beginning, you can say some of it comes from Scotland, but it also is true, I think, that quite a lot of it comes from London. London is the most revolutionary part of England. The Levellers, it's not a coincidence. This is Putney. The Levellers were very popular in London. When Charles left London in 1642, he never went back because it was too dangerous a city for the king to be in. And one of the things that Cromwell had to do, in a way, was to keep control of London. Is it possible to say that in this story, London is a more revolutionary place than England?
Yes, it is. Going back to your first point about Scotland looks very unrevolutionary in these. I mean, that may have been where Charles's authority started to crumble. That may have been the first people to take up arms. But I mean, the first thing they do is crown. They want a monarchy restored.
And he's their king. I mean, he's a Scottish king.
He's their Scottish king. He goes to Scotland. I mean, maybe the tragedy for the English is that none of the Stuarts are interested just in being King of Scotland anymore. I mean, they regard the English crown as theirs rightfully too. Probably the English couldn't have cared less if the Scots had crowned him and Charles had gone off to Scotland and stayed there. But that was never going to happen. But going back to London, yeah, I mean, that is a fatal moment for the Royalist cause when Charles leaves London in January 1642, having attempted to suppress the parliamentary opposition to him by walking into the House of Commons and trying to arrest 5 members and being told the birds have flown. And to this day, no British monarch has ever gone into the Commons. I mean, all the theatre that we reenact every year with Black Rod is to make that point that the Commons is not somewhere where monarchs can appear and arrest individuals. And Charles loses control of London from that point, and that has massive economic implications in terms of just the resources that can pay the new model army. It has massive implications in terms of not having a figurehead around whom Londoners could have any credibility or belief. And the networks and the sheer power of print and the energy of the publishing industry that's centered in London creates this ferment of hugely radical ideas, all based often around decentralized congregations.
What then should we think about the role of Parliament in this story, because it's conventionally, this is described, this war, the civil war, as a war between king and Parliament. It begins with a set-piece confrontation, as you say, between king and Parliament. So their Parliament and London go together. He has to leave London because London is where Westminster is. But as the war progresses, and particularly as we get to the denouement and its aftermath, Parliament is sidelined. I mean, Parliament becomes a kind of shell. It's not the centre of this story. Those various constitutional experiments are experiments outside Parliament to control Parliament, to purge Parliament, to tame Parliament. Where does Parliament end up in this? Parliament looks like it's been almost delegitimised by the victory of the parliamentary side in this war, because in the end, the settlement, before we even get to the return of the king on the king's terms, the settlement is being driven by forces outside of Parliament, and it is essentially a military settlement. Where do you think Parliament's status is in the 1650s?
Well, earlier in the 1640s, it's the case that actually there's not only one parliament. I mean, Charles tries to create his own parliaments in Oxford as well. So Parliament almost sort of loses its sense as a monopoly.
It's like two popes. It's never a good moment.
Exactly. It's never a good option. Well, most of the constitutional experiments have some idea of an assembly. So really the rump parliament remains the default, but it becomes increasingly unrepresentative of the people. And there is always this fear haunting those in power that if you were to call free and fair elections, it would result in an overwhelming royalist majority. And that is essentially what happens. Ironically, perhaps, when Cromwell himself dies in September 1658, he is thought to have nominated his eldest son, Richard, to take over as Lord Protector. And that seems, again, to smack of hereditary monarchy. It's not a meritocratic decision. Richard, unlike his father, holds respect from neither the army nor Parliament, and the whole thing sort of crumbles. There are, again, a series of short-lived regimes, but eventually free elections are held by a convention Parliament. So Parliament does re-enter the story, working in tandem with the army at the very end. General Monk marches again from Scotland. I mean, again, one of the themes of this period is the number of times that usually Scots entering England, but that there are sort of interactions. And General Monk has been leader of the Cromwellian, the Protectorate in Scotland. He marches down, demands full elections on the terms that had been in the Long Parliament in 1641. And the Convention Parliament declares that it wishes to invite Charles II to return. So Parliament becomes a very important part of that restoration vision. Charles himself is very Charles II. By now he's 30 by 1660. He is very well advised, again by Hyde, and issues Declaration of Breda in April 1660 that is very non-vindictive. And one of the fears haunting all of these regimes had always been about indemnity. You know, one of the reasons you have to keep fighting is because if you allow the king back in or something, then you'll be done for treason. Charles makes very clear that he will not be coming back on a vindictive basis. The only people he is interested in pursuing are the very small number of people who signed his father's death warrant. He also wants to offer a liberty to tender consciences, and he actually allows Parliament to determine a lot of the key decisions, such as the church settlement. I mean, ironically, Charles's view of an ideal religious settlement is less narrow and exclusivist than the one that the Cavalier Parliament, because by the time Parliament is recalled, it's full of royalists who are keen on revenge and vengeance. But the language in which Charles II presents his monarchy is strategically moderate, and an act of oblivion is passed. There's a joke at the time that the Act of Indemnity and Oblivion basically gives indemnity to former parliamentarians and oblivion to former royalists. So, you know, there are lots of scores to be settled, and England is not united by any way in 1660. But Parliament does have a key role there.
Those two ways of thinking about this as a revolution that I mentioned at the beginning, the classic notion of a revolution, which is a restoration, the wheel turns full circle, and the more modern idea of a revolution, which is an explosion of a new politics and an upending of the old order, the old regime. And these two things happen in the period 1642 to 1660. By the time the wheel has turned full circle, the king, the son of the executed king, is invited back on non-vindictive terms, but it's completely clear, as it were, who's in charge here in this negotiation. Once you've invited the king back, having executed his father, you have more or less conceded defeat. But there was also, at the heart of the 1650s, a really radical set of experiments in new ways of not just doing politics, but of communicating about politics, of involving people in politics, new ways of thinking about the possibilities of religious settlements. When the wheel has turned full circle, we're not just back in 1641. It's not the case. History doesn't work like that. You don't end up back where you started. It might look a bit like that, but it's not like that. Which bits of the radical part, the heart, the people who in the 20th century want to call this the English Revolution to stand with those other revolutions, even if it petered out, which bits at the heart of that story do you think are still there after 1660? Where is there a legacy of this extraordinary upheaval? When the wheel turns full circle, there is a point at which it is 180 degrees and the world is upside down, as people use that language at the time. The world has been turned upside down. When it was restored right way up in the eyes of the royalists, which bits of the upside down world were still lingering about, do you think?
There were some very practical changes that we haven't discussed, such as putting the language of the law into English, readmitting the Jews to England. I mean, there were significant changes, thinking much more creatively and realistically about the finance of the state. I mean, it may have been a very heavily taxed regime because of the army, but also that forced the rejection of ideas that, really the king should just live off his own. And these ideas would certainly be picked up later in the 1690s. But I think more than that, a recognition, and Charles is very clear, Charles II, that he is only on the throne for as long as his people want him to be there, that there is a sort of conditionality. He very sensibly moves responsibility for pre-publication censorship to Parliament. So that becomes actually quite difficult to manage, and eventually pre-publication censorship dissolves really at the end of the 17th century, that you cannot control what is printed. So it is very hard to put all of these ideas back in a box and expect them to stay there. But what also happens at the same time, perhaps the more negative legacy, is a real fear about the speed with which events can escalate. The phrase that is what we'll talk about next time, but the next revolution is a determination not to allow a radical minority to take the initiative, but to prevent the effusion of blood. I think what you choose to remember and what you choose to forget after a revolution is very telling. And even in the 1650s, the Protectorate had not authorized a plan for great murals or tapestries of the great Civil War victories. I mean, this wasn't a regime even then that had celebrated Marston Moor and Naseby. The 13th of January does become an annual point certainly in the Church of England's calendar to remember. But again, that also brought, as well as remembering Charles I, it brought an onus on upholding the rule of law and not allowing society to crumble with the speed in which it had. I mean, I think we have edited out of our revolutionary story the sheer scale of the civil wars. I mean, more people died as a result of the civil wars in the 1640s than died as a proportion of the population in World War One and World War Two combined. And in places like Ireland, I mean, the levels of ethnic cleansing and atrocity were horrific. Some of that was deliberately forgotten in the 1660s and 1670s. And again, that's a pattern very familiar to post-revolutionary eras. But I think there is always a nervousness. The rector of Bath Abbey puts it brilliantly in the 1660s. And he says, people that have once rebelled are like a pot of water that's boiled. It will always be just that readier to boil again. It's a nervous, traumatized generation. And I think that is quite hard to eradicate, that sense of this could all go wrong again.
It's very interesting the way you put it, though, that the lesson that had to be drawn is what had gone wrong, what had created this chaos was allowing radical minorities their head. The thought that this is not a revolutionary nation, but it contains within it pockets of really destabilizing radical religious and political thought, religion as much as politics. And that what had gone wrong in a way, as seen from the 1660s and maybe even in 1688 and beyond, was the way in which those radical elements came to the surface and to the top. And that, of course, could only happen through military force, essentially. That was not going to happen in Parliament on its own terms. A lot of this came through the army. But would it be fair to say that the lesson that was drawn was that the danger of this kind of revolutionary chaos comes from not the spirit of the times or the temper of the people, but the fact in these societies like England had become in the middle of the 17th century, full of intellectual ferment, there are some very, very dangerous people, and they're the ones that you have to watch out for.
I think that is one of the lessons. I think also it breeds a real distrust of military power, because a lot of what we talked about today is power of the army. So no standing armies. I mean, that's where the power of that line becomes, partly because they could be deployed to suppress radical ideas, but also partly because they could be deployed against one's own citizens.
And against one's own parliament. Last question. In the histories of the Civil War, the thing that people sometimes try and find in this part of the story, we're going to talk about 1688-89 next time, is just some sort of little green shoots of what is going to be called democracy. So you talked about elections, free and fair elections, a phrase that's associated, but on a very, very restricted franchise. There were radical ideas from the Levelers and others about the nature of representation, which we might find in those ideas some early foreshadowings of what we come to think of as democracy. But in our conversation, the word democracy hasn't come up at all. Afterwards, people like Thomas Hobbes called the parliamentarian side the democratical element, but he was using it to stigmatize them. I mean, this is his way of saying these people were mad. Should the word democracy feature at all in this story, do you think? Well, republicanism, absolutely, and the different varieties of republicanism, drawing on classical and early modern antecedents, but democracy is a whole different kettle of fish.
It is, and it was only used, as you say, as a term of abuse. I think, in a way, we wouldn't be talking about this today had subsequent generations not looked back and found different aspects of inspiration in the writings of the 1640s and 1650s. I mean, it's very hard to read the transcript of the Putney debates. Colonel Thomas Rainsborough, when he says, I think the poorest he that is in England hath a life to live, as much a right to live as the greatest he. Every man that lives under a government must put himself there by consent. I mean, these may not have been ideas that gained universal traction. They may not have been ideas that were seen through, but they were articulated. And I think subsequent generations have always looked back at this period and found different aspects of it. I mean, one thing we haven't talked about today as well is the idea that these were England's last wars of religion. And I think one of the difficulties with that interpretations of the Civil War in the second half of the 20th century was this idea that they were always somehow the key to modernity. And then something like 9/11 happened, and the force of religious fundamentalism and the degree to which people were more concerned about the world to come than the world on earth again proved inspirational to new generations of historians looking at the Civil War. So I think whether one's looking at, we also haven't talked about people like James Harrington, who put forward a very different view of land ownership and the relationship between land ownership and political power. I mean, there are so many ways in which these decades in English history stimulated new ways of thinking about perennial problems that I think that's why we return so often to this period.
And yet, I take from what you're saying that you think it should be possible to simultaneously think about this event as religious wars, dynastic wars, driven by ideas which have deep roots in earlier periods and are recognizable from earlier kinds of upheavals, and yet also see it as something new and in it something which is going to leave that world behind. It is a kind of bridge event, isn't it? It also isn't, because the wheel turns full circle, and in some ways it's a bridge to nowhere, and yet it is also a bridge event in the history of thinking about modern politics. It contains the old and the new, doesn't it?
I think it is a bridge event. I think it does absolutely bridge an older world. I mean, it makes sense of some of the deep political problems thrown up by the Reformation to a world that we would think of as 17th, sort of early 18th century Enlightenment rationalist ideas. I mean, I think you can see both the more backward looking and the forward looking to talk about it in those terms. I think absolutely this is a characteristically Janus-faced era, that people will look to the past to find sources of legitimation for new ideas. And at the same time, they will be thinking the unthinkable, because these are hitherto entirely unforeseen circumstances.
This is a notable episode for us because we've realized that one of you listening is our 5 millionth download. We don't know who you are. If we did, we would come and find you and give you a year's free supply of chocolate. But in the absence of that, we just want to say thank you to everyone who has downloaded this podcast, and to remind you, we're a tiny team. We really value your support. If you would like to sign up to PPF Plus, you will get ad-free listening and lots of bonus episodes. We also have a new edition of our free fortnightly newsletter out tomorrow. We've been getting some great feedback on the newsletter. So if you haven't tried it, do. I hope you'll really enjoy it. To sign up, just click on the link in the show description or go to our website, ppfideas.com. Next time, Clare Jackson and I will be talking about what is sometimes called the Glorious Revolution, the Revolution of 1688. Was it glorious? Was it really a revolution? And how did it change not just English, but world history? Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future, brought to you in partnership with the London Review of Books. Past, Present, Future is part of the Airwave podcast network.